Good evening, everyone. It is World AIDS Day, which is a global commemoration of the impact of HIV and AIDS on everyone on the earth. It's a very important day where we take a moment to honor the legacy of those lost and also honor the lives of those affected, both directly by the viruses and their families and loved ones and their broader communities. Today, we have a very special tribute to World AIDS Day, and it is an edition of Viewers Advisory, which is our ongoing series where library staff and guests chat about different film and TV recommendations. My name is Nicholas Brown. I'm the COO for Communication and Outreach at the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. So grateful for all of you who have chosen to join us for a little bit this evening. Before I introduce my wonderful colleague, Chris, I just want to invite everyone to join us on social media tonight. If you would be willing to share the feed of this broadcast, we're live on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. We'd love to have you join in the conversation with the hashtag World AIDS Day. And also invite you to visit our LGBTQ plus Pride heritage page on the library's website, which is pgcmls.info/pride, for some really great resources and recommendations. So without further ado, I would love for my colleague Chris to introduce himself. Chris, take it away.
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm a Library Associate 1 at the Bowie branch.
Awesome. And Chris is, both of us are actually members of the library's LGBTQ plus team, which is a group of staff from throughout the library system in different departments, branches, and different roles who are all working together to ensure that the library is very much proactively positioning itself as an inclusive space for LGBTQ plus members of the community and also their allies. And that involves both training and resources for staff so that we are prepared to serve all Prince Georgians equally and equitably. And also we get to put together some really great programs like tonight. So Chris, can you give us a bit of an explanation of what World AIDS Day is and the history of it?
So World AIDS Day started in 1988. It's always been December 1st, and it is a global health awareness day, kind of, as you said previously, in recognition of people living with HIV AIDS, in remembrance of those that have died from it, and to spread awareness to combat stigma of the disease and to raise medical treatment and hopefully one day find a cure.
Awesome. Thank you for that explanation. A few facts and figures just to throw out for everyone who's tuning in. According to the UN, there are currently 38 million people globally living with HIV, which of course HIV is not the same thing as AIDS, but it is a precursor to AIDS. And there are 25.4 million people who are currently accessing antiretroviral therapy, which is basically the life-saving variety of treatments that allows people who live with HIV to have the chance of reaching what is now known as undetectable status, where the infection is suppressed enough so that you are not passing it along to others. 1.7 million people become newly infected with HIV, and I believe that's on an annual basis. And just in the past year, 690,000 people died from AIDS-related illnesses around the world. So this is very much still a dire public health crisis that really reveals some of the inequities in the healthcare system, both in our country and also globally. We think of the topics like prescription drug access and such. HIV can be a chronic illness at this point, and it can be managed, but it really depends upon access to healthcare and or programs where you can get subsidized treatment. So, first question that we're going to tackle is what were our first perceptions or experiences of HIV/AIDS? I just want to preface that tonight's whole discussion is just our two personal experiences and recommendations on films and different materials that you can learn about HIV and AIDS from. We are in no way, shape, or form public health experts. We are not experts in HIV/AIDS history or policy. We are just consumers of the same information that all of you have access to, and we are able to we're just trying to really get the conversation going by hosting this chat tonight. So this is very much two lay people coming to this conversation with hope of shedding some light and creating some dialogue. And we would love to hear from you in the chat throughout with any questions or comments. So Chris, what do you think of that? What was your first perception or experience of this?
I think when I was a kid in elementary school, the Scholastic Book Club, they would give us these little kind of daily newspapers in our English classes. And as I recall, one of them had the story of Ryan White, who was an elementary school student in the early 90s who contracted HIV from a blood transfusion. He had hemophilia. And at the time when there was a lot more stigma around the disease, and people didn't realize the basic facts of how you can transmit and not transmit the virus, there was a lot of fear. And at one point, he was under threat of being kicked out of his school. And he kind of became one of the first, you could say, lay people faces of this is a virus that can affect anyone. And I think at the time, though, as a kid, it still felt like something that was happening elsewhere out there.
And just for anyone who is not super familiar with Ryan White, there is a very important piece of legislation that the Congress passed at the federal level in August of 1990. It's called the Ryan White Comprehensive AIDS Resources Emergency Care Act. And that legislation, and without knowing much of the details about it, I do know that it helps provide access to healthcare and treatment for folks who might not have health coverage or other opportunities to access it. So his name is attached to that and is a very recognizable story in conversations about HIV/AIDS history in the United States. For me personally, without having realized it, was through my school and elementary school, I think as early as maybe kindergarten or first grade, my family and a lot of the families in the schools participated in some relief efforts to get meals out to people living with HIV and AIDS around the holidays, kind of like a Meals on Wheels type thing. I grew up in the Boston area, and this was probably early 90s, early mid 90s, something like that. I didn't really have an awareness of why or what or how, but in retrospect, this is a very vivid memory that I remember having done this. And then in middle school, I was involved in a community service club at school, and some of us who were kind of the peer leaders of the group decided that we wanted to have the school participate in the AIDS Walk in Boston on an annual basis. And we came up with a team for the school, and over time, that team became like the top fundraising team for the walk, which is of a school, which is really the school still has a team every year that goes. This is now like 20 years later, something, or even more than that. Yeah, 25 years later.
Oh wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, so I kind of found myself connected to the whole notion of like, what is this topic, before I really understood anything about it at all. I kind of sensed that there was a need to support each other in the community around HIV/AIDS, and then it kind of shifting back to what we're talking about tonight, the way that this part of our history is depicted in film and TV and music and pop culture, ultimately is how most people, I think, probably become aware of it and come to learn things about what HIV/AIDS means and how that impacts people. While that's probably good in some ways, it's hugely problematic in other ways. So for example, like the huge stigmas that exist of this being a disease that only affects gay men, that's obviously not the reality or the full truth. And the Ryan White example is, of course, a prime example of it not being an adult gay man who was exposed through intimate contact. And with the reflections of popular culture in a lot of the things that we're probably going to cover tonight, it is largely skewed towards white gay men in terms of the depictions. Right. We're not going to just focus on those depictions, of course, because that wouldn't be appropriate. But there is that reality where, if we're talking about depictions in Hollywood, depictions in TV, there's a lot of racial inequity in terms representation there that does carry into this HIV/AIDS debate now. And where this is really interesting in this moment in time in our country is that we're kind of at this period of tension where those with resources and those with privilege are those who have the access to the treatments that are life-saving and making HIV a manageable and survivable and basically just a chronic immune condition. Whereas there are still so many people who just simply don't have that access. And this isn't even something about living in the United States versus Africa. There are places in Africa where you have better access to generic brand drugs of life-saving treatments that here would literally bankrupt you in probably 1 or 2 months if you didn't have health insurance or access to Ryan White support. So that was a very long-winded answer, but that's where I'm coming from in this conversation. So do you think there is a divide on how LGBTQ plus people and straight people view the disease?
I think that divide is being closed. Oh, definitely, probably in the last several years, just with, as you were saying before, it used to be considered only like a gay men's disease. But now through various shows and movies, there's a greater expansion of realizing that it can affect any community depending on race, class, economic status, and it's also recognized that who it's a manageable disease for, and like you said, who it still is more of a struggle for, because whether you have access to health insurance or healthcare, or whether the nearest clinic or hospital is a few blocks away or several miles away.
In my own kind of sense of things, there's certainly a divide between LGBTQ plus people and heterosexual people, or people that kind of are more in the heteronormative world. And I think that divide is really stark, but also shrinking, as you said. I think the other divide that I know we're going to cover a bit is within the LGBTQ plus community. And one of the things that many people probably don't realize is, especially if you're not closely related to someone who's in the LGBTQ plus community or in it yourself, is that there is very strong stigma about HIV/AIDS within the LGBTQ plus community. And it comes up now probably more generationally, but where the area that is most blatantly apparent is in online dating. And in the same ways that it's problematic that people are kind of blatantly stating their racial preferences with online dating, disclosure of HIV status is a significant thing that is kind of introduced into the online dating space, and then of course in the extension of meeting up in person. But when you think of the whole hookup culture with dating apps and hookup apps and such, there's terminology and jargon that folks within the community learn or are using that comes to represent, how they're related to HIV/AIDS, whether they're at least at back in the day, I don't know what's still going on now. DDF was a abbreviation that would be used, drug and disease free, and that applies to HIV/AIDS and other STIs. So there is still a lot of stigma and division within the LGBTQ plus community, and I think over the last few years, as PrEP and Truvada have become a bit more mainstream as a result of really extensive marketing campaigns that have been happening globally, some of those stigmas are starting to get broken down a bit, but they very much still exist. And then, within the LGBTQ plus community, like my experience as a gay male, that's my understanding of all of these discussions and topics, but there are different implications for transgender individuals. There are different implications for lesbians. There are different implications for genderqueer and nonconforming folks and others. So it's really important to remember that within this bucket, right, when we separate LGBTQ plus and straight, there is a divide there, but there's also a lot of divide and nuance within the LGBTQ plus community that is inevitably going to always be there. But I think the more that we can all kind of proactively create spaces for shared understanding, it opens the door to healing and creating some divisions and such. So then what we wanted to cover was generational divide, which I know we've kind of mentioned from that online dating perspective, but what are your thoughts on that in terms of generational experience with HIV AIDS and where we are now versus what things were in the mid to late 80s and early 90s even?
I think it was interesting because when I went into college and started exploring like gay and queer literature, I kind of I was always a very big history buff, so I started reading up on the history, and so I started reading up on Larry Kramer and Vito Rousseau and ACT UP, and so it was kind of mind blowing to me that there were these um, gay men and queer people, and again, kind of like the whole image of the stereotype that AIDS and HIV can only affect gay men. It's also the fact that the stories that are being told about the activists that fought for healthcare rights, because this was more not always just centered on like gay white men who were maybe college educated, but there was a wide swath of people, lesbians, women of color, unhoused people, who were all joining together and doing what they could, whether it was like artistic design or they had a knowledge of the healthcare system or they became literal kind of underground pharmacists. There was this massive collusion and working together, but then this first stories that are still now being told through whether it's documentaries or fictional film, they're still kind of centering mainly on the gay white men, which I'm seeing that start to change a bit now.
Thank you. On the generational point, I think with any major global crisis, even the coronavirus, when we look back at this in 25 years, if you didn't live in the moment at the peak of the emergency, so to speak, your experience and relation is going to be different, of course. So I would say that anyone from teenagers up through middle age and even early senior citizen years who was at that age, at the height of the AIDS epidemic in the 80s and early 90s, the experience that they lived is unfathomable, and those of us who are younger, we could never understand it, because these folks were seeing their entire social circles wiped out in some cases, and of course being out and open as an LGBTQ plus American wasn't accepted then as it is now, and so you had a lot of people dying without their families even knowing that they had been a member of the LGBTQ plus community, without even knowing that they had contracted HIV and AIDS. And it's really kind of devastating to even begin to kind of try and fathom what people experience. And these are people who are living now who lived through this, and so, and with any, like we've talked about the greatest generation, World War II, some people are able to talk about it and others simply can't because it's just too difficult for their own coping. And I think that change, the generational change, is what has become most apparent between that generation that was kind of already at adulthood in the 80s versus probably the millennial generation as being the generation, the first generation to be very removed from that whole period. And because ultimately millennials were being born the height of this or later. And by the time AZT was introduced and other treatments started to be introduced in the 90s, the death rates, at least here, likely started coming down pretty quickly as a result of those treatments, but have remained high in many other places. And even here, people are still dying all the time as a result of HIV and AIDS. And one of the tricky things with like the PrEP conversation is that just because there are treatments doesn't mean that it's not a huge problem. And sometimes there's a lot of complacency that has become part of the experience, especially for younger folks. And, PrEP is great, but it doesn't protect you from anything but HIV.
One
Yeah,
single
there's a
STD.
lot of other things that you can
There's others out there.
contract. Yeah, and not having, and folks not having lived that close to the peak of HIV/AIDS having an impact on everyone. You know, there's something that happens when you have lived experience in terms of the way that you approach things that is probably different for younger folks. But I think even like in my adulthood in the last 10 years, I've seen a huge shift in the openness of talking about this within the LGBTQ plus community, millennial ages and younger generations. It still has a long way to go. I'm happy and relieved to see some change, even though there's a long way to go. So we've covered trends, and maybe to shift a bit to the talk about films and TV fictions and such. There seem to be stages in terms of how HIV/AIDS is depicted in documentaries and films and plays and TV and such. And in any of the documentaries and even the feature films that depict the early period of HIV/AIDS, the lack of treatments is a huge part of the narrative. Can you comment a little bit on that, on some of the that are available library, and how the lack of treatments is depicted?
So basically, there's, if you think about kind of a mainstream option of Tom Hanks in Philadelphia, where they didn't, it's kind of from the whole movie on, the moment we find out that he is HIV positive, it was still a death sentence then. It's kind of, even through the courtroom drama of the movie, you're waiting for the moment when you know that the Tom Hanks character is going to go into the hospital for the last time. And that's kind of the same thing, even with all the fictional depictions. It was always a death sentence, and it was always a tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
But then one thing that's been kind of fascinating is of the last decades, maybe starting about 2010, there has been some documentaries that cover the queer activist groups and nurses and doctors that were trying any which way they could to find treatment. And that comes from the documentaries How to Survive a Plague by David France and United in Anger by Sarah Schulman and Jim Hubbard. And they were, willing to, they would work outside of the system and then even within the system. Given with some of our current times today, in How to Survive a Plague, Dr. Anthony Fauci appears, and there's kind of a great line where he says, at a certain point, you realize these people who were not trained doctors, not trained medical experts at first, but they were the only people, they were people with this disease who were trying to save their own lives. And Fauci says at a certain point, you realize these people knew a bit more than we did at a certain point, because they were literally trying to educate to save their lives, whereas some of the more mainstream doctors were just trying to, in some of the activist views, just try to find a medication so they could ramp up for pharmaceutical pricing.
How to Survive a Plague is one of the several films that cover HIV/AIDS that also exists as a book. This is it here. It's worth checking out. This is quite a hefty book. The picture there on that IMDb listing for How to Survive a Plague shows Larry Kramer, who was one of the most and polar HIV/AIDS activist, involved in founding one of the leading groups in New York City at the height of the AIDS epidemic, Gay Men's Health Crisis, I believe, and was involved in many others. But one of the things that comes out in a lot of the documentaries and even the feature films are the as with any activism movement, the divisions that existed in terms of preferences for tactics. And one of the things that you see in these films, which I think is really well depicted in David France's film, is going, the arguments and the fights and that were happening within these meetings of these organizations because of how passionate people had to be. It was literally life and death, and it felt like the government was completely absent intentionally from stepping in to save people's lives, which is really, at the end of the day, the government. If the government can't save people's lives, what is the government for? And it's really fascinating in the David France and some of the other the advocacy movements evolved and changed over time. And then when there were one of the great documentaries that's in Canopy covers the ACT UP organization. Can you chat about that, Chris?
That was United in Anger, an oral history of ACT UP by Sarah Hubbard. And it's interesting because that and How to Survive a Plague almost kind of work as parallel films on each other, where you see some of the same footage in both movies. But United in Anger digs a bit more into the wider variety of activists and kind of different network groups within the larger activist group as a whole. And there was there was a Latin artist group that kind of exclusively designed posters and did kind of street demonstrations. There was a specific group that dealt with unhoused minority women. And it kind of, there's a famous ACT UP chant, healthcare is a human right. And so even though there was, and it's kind of discussed a bit in there, and something, as you were saying, there was contention and debate. And to some of the members, they felt like some of the more well-off gay men who were suddenly kind of, their life status was stricken with HIV and AIDS. It kind of felt like that if they once found a cure, they would then abandon the group. Whereas other people were already dealing with housing insecurities and doctors not giving attention to the fact that HIV developed and was seen differently in cis women than in cis men. There was a whole fact that cis women could not get in the initial drug trials because they were only focusing on how the virus appeared in cis men. And so, and at a certain point, it's kind of echoes back on what we're dealing with now. We're still dealing with basic access of healthcare and who has access to it depending on their insurance, their zip code, and where they have access to hospitals and health clinics.
One of the things that was that strikes me about that these different films and TV shows tie the narrative together with not intentionally at all, but there are some big inflection points of HIV AIDS activism in the United States, and particularly with ACT UP, they had protests in New York City at St. Patrick's Cathedral, where they went in and started yelling at the cardinal who was kind of propagating the hatred from the pulpit, and then folks laid down in the aisle and didn't leave until they had been dragged out by the police effectively as trespassers. And those moments are captured on film in the documentaries, and they also have become kind of moments in a lot of fictionalized depictions. Mm-hmm. So one of the just to read a bit of the New York Times coverage from 1989, which is kind of cool that I just found it. This is from New York Times. The headline is called 111 held in St. Patrick's AIDS protest. Goes, quote, while some 4,500 people demonstrated outside St. Patrick's Cathedral yesterday, several dozen interrupted the mass at 10:15 a.m. to protest John Cardinal O'Connor's recent statements on abortion, homosexuality, and AIDS. Some of the protesters chained themselves to pews inside the cathedral, while others shouted or lay in aisles. "We will not be silent," a protester, Michael Petrellis, 30 years old, screamed before the police arrested him. "We will fight O'Connor's bigotry." And that goes on. But if you see the T-shirt that Chris is wearing right now, if he's willing to show us, it says "Silence equals death," and with the pink triangle. And if you've ever seen that around, that is the symbolism that was used in the movement at this time in the 80s and early 90s, because it very much seemed that the voices advocating for treatment and support from the government were just flat out not being heard, and that was on the low level. And one of the fictionalized depictions of this that comes to mind recently from the TV show that was produced by FX and is groundbreaking for many, many different reasons. But there's HIV and AIDS have a very prominent kind of underlying current in the series throughout, as it's from this period of the late 80s to the early 90s. And people become exposed to HIV and AIDS, and their experience of being concerned about that, of going to get tested in the early days, of getting access to treatment in the early days. Several characters test positive and are living with it and surviving it, but you kind of go through their journeys of how they're coping with it, how they're planning for life beyond, and how they're even trying to support each other with it. And two of the characters who are really prominent in this are Blanca Evangelista, who's of course the house mother that MJ Rodriguez plays, who is diagnosed with HIV positive pretty early in the series. And then later on, Pray Tell, who is the character played by Billy Porter, also gets a positive diagnosis. And through his story, we are taken into the AIDS wards at the hospitals. And also with all of that kind of personal lived experience that's depicted in the TV show, you see how activism played a part in all of this. And you see how the different people in the LGBTQ plus community wanted to participate or wanted to stay away from it, or had to be concerned about work and what the perception of them was. And it Pose, I think, is of the more recent TV shows and things that have depicted this period in America, specifically in New York, and also HIV AIDS, has, I think, gone the deepest in terms of representing people's journeys during the time. Certainly much more than when we think about Will and Grace, which was groundbreaking, it being the first real depiction of LGBTQ plus major characters on TV. But I was just looking up in my research for today, that while Will and Grace was pretty much airing only 10 years from the height of the AIDS epidemic in the 80s, there was only one mention of HIV AIDS in the entire first run of the series, which ran almost 200 episodes. And the only mention was in one episode about someone going to get an HIV test. And that made me think a lot about, they had to have omitted references intentionally. And I think if we think about like comparing Will and Grace to Pose, they reflect where society is with processing HIV AIDS and the impact of it, because I'm sure that back then someone at least was advocating for not necessarily making it about HIV AIDS because it was so close and people wanted to move the stigma away from gay men having AIDS and HIV. I don't know if that was the intention behind it, but it certainly seems like it may have been. Which is interesting because on the flip side, Will and Grace does play into a lot of stereotypes and kind of the traditional campness of Jack's character, who is delightful, even if it's not necessarily the best stereotype in the world. What are your thoughts on the kind of that change in depictions?
It kind of always struck me there, like, as generational fatigue. Like you said, it came so close to the time, like shortly after they developed I think, did it start in 97?
I think around then, or 98.
Okay, yeah. And so it started so shortly after, when they finally developed the protease inhibitor cocktail that vastly saved many, many lives. And at that point, it was like kind of like there was finally like a pause, a breathing moment. So we can tell stories about queer life that are not about being sick or fighting for your life. So can we just do a lighthearted comedy? But then when you go back with what Pose is doing, it was interesting. I was looking back on like historical elements, and I was looking back to a colleague of ours that brought up Magic Johnson's HIV diagnosis announcement, and the way he became kind of like a heroic / tragic figure overnight, and that one of the major sports stars within American basketball and a black straight man was ended up championing himself as a voice on HIV education, but then his career ended. And I feel like today he could still keep playing. It was just there was still that kind of last old school stigma of HIV and AIDS at the time. Whereas you go with Pose now, where it's a cast of Black and Latin, trans, and gay women and men, and they're confronting HIV at the start historically, but they're still celebrating their lives. They're living with the disease, and the fact with the character that Billy Porter plays, Pray Tell, not going to try to spoil too much, but later on in the second season, he develops a relationship with another HIV positive man, but it's also there's a slight age difference between them. So there's also that intergenerational experience and how they react as an older Black gay man and a younger Black gay man to having and living with this disease.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing about Pose that I think is really significant, is that it seems to me that it's the first or one of the first mainstream depictions of members of the trans community who've been affected by HIV/AIDS. And if you think about everything, all of the major depictions of the late 80s and 90s, we're thinking about the ACT UPs and the gay men's health crisis, and it's like Larry Kramer in terms of what has been captured by kind of the mainstream narrative of this, and it leaves out so many people. And the same thing happens with Stonewall, where certain people will get credited as having started things at the Stonewall Inn and such, but in fact it was folks like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera who as representatives and symbols of Black and brown trans women were oftentimes leading the charge. And this was even evident, I believe it was in one of the recent election cycles, in some of the primary debates. It might have even been this recent cycle where trans issues were really completely absent from the debate stage on one party probably wouldn't have even gone there, but there were moments where trans women were standing up in these primary debates and town halls and demanding answers from the candidates, because the trans issues and challenges are oftentimes so blatantly left off out of the conversations. This is changing somewhat in some circles, I think, as a result of the courage to kind of go against the grain that a lot in the trans community have had to do. But big props to Pose for this depiction. And another show that I'd like to throw out is Queer as Folk, specifically the American edition. This was a series that I think was early aughts, or maybe a little earlier in the UK.
Early 2000s.
Yeah. And so in reflecting back on Queer as Folk, which for me was very formative, it was like the first time I had watched Will and Grace, but Queer as Folk gives you like a little more depth in terms of like
more opening,
to say the very least. And there are 3 characters in Queer as Folk who have HIV or AIDS. And they again represent this intergenerational interaction with it. The first character is Uncle Vic, as the mom's brother who lives with the family there for a period. And he, one of the interesting things that I was watching an interview, the creators of the series, there's a period in the series where he's very, very ill and he thinks he's going to die, and he just starts running up his card bills, thinking that he's not going to have to ever pay them off. But then fortunately he survives, and then he kind of has to pay. Then Ben, who is the boyfriend and partner, Michael, who is Uncle Vic's nephew, and Ben is very like, looks like a Ken doll, university professor, very built, blonde, and he's HIV positive, but is the embodiment of health. So that if you're thinking about Magic Johnson, if you're thinking about Rock Hudson, even he is that stereotypical American jock kind of look. Yet he too can have HIV or AIDS. And then the third character is a younger guy who is straight, but is a sex worker who Michael and Ben take in and eventually adopt. And the story is really sad about the way that this guy's mother had kind of pushed him to do sex work. But he becomes HIV positive as well. And so then you have these three generations of men kind of all interacting with each other around this issue that is affecting them, that they have encountered perhaps in a similar way, but they have different kind of perspectives because of the generational differences, and also because of their own differences in terms of their coming out journeys, and one being straight even. So thinking about the generational differences, and then also some of the major kind of celebrity figures who have been involved in the narrative, as of a millennial age, the figures of like Rock Hudson and Magic Johnson, I was either not born or was too young to really be aware or have their coming out as HIV positive really my awareness, which is something that I've had to then address in my own education around this. There are a lot. Would you care to mention a couple of them that I know we were thinking about?
So there was, are you talking more in like contemporary terms, or?
Yeah, so like Arthur Ashe, and if you think about Alvin Ailey was another figure, and then even the straight women who related to these folks, so like Elizabeth Taylor.
Yeah, so it was, I mean, the impact of Elizabeth Taylor, who was probably one of the hugest old school movie stars of her era, the fact that she embraced the queer community and then people with HIV, and she campaigned, and I believe she had a hand. Did she have a hand in starting Oxfam?
I believe so. Let's see.
Where she lent her voice and her, you could say, star power for HIV education and charities and fundraisers. And then Arthur Ashe, as also again as a African American tennis champion, kind of in a similar way with Magic Johnson, where he was able to bring a masculine image of someone who was still living with HIV and lent his voice to advocacy. And you mentioned Alvin Ailey.
Yeah, so Alvin Ailey was another, of course, a great American choreographer and dancer who eventually died of complications with HIV and AIDS. And one of the things that I think this kind of just talking about these figures in pop culture who were affected, it really opens the conversation about how a generation of people was decimated by this virus, and the creativity and the talent that was lost as a result of that is something that we'll never know how much we lost. So for a person who I think a lot about who died from HIV/AIDS is Howard Ashman, who was a very famous lyricist and composer. He was one of the creators of Beauty and the Beast, Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Little Shop of Horrors, many other things. And this is a guy whose work is literally in the core canon of American pop culture across generations.
Childhood pop culture, yeah.
And number one, most people would not even realize that he had HIV/AIDS, or let alone that he was gay. But there are thousands and thousands of people just like him whose creative output and contributions to society were just completely snuffed out as a result of this. And one of the really important things to talk about with this is the AIDS Memorial Quilt project, which is a place where a lot of the lives are remembered, and is really an important tribute in that it equalizes these celebrities with the everyday person who was affected by HIV/AIDS, and it really is a testament to everyone being of one humanity. So let me just pull up here on screen real quick their website. The papers of the AIDS quilt project are now at the Library of Congress, and then the quilt panels themselves are housed in San Francisco. But you can see here, this is a very shrunken down depiction of the different panels. But if I was to look up on here, let's say Rock Hudson, you can actually see, it will take you into the panel where that person is represented. It might be multiple panels in some cases. Let me pull up Alvin Ailey as well, or actually Howard Ashman. Here's one with Howard Ashman. To our friend Howard, who gave a mermaid her voice and a beast his soul, we will be forever grateful. So this is some really powerful stuff, and I did see the quilt when it was out on the mall, but I've had the opportunity to see various panels of it on display at various things. It is really moving, and I used to work at the Library of Congress, and there was an effort by staff in the 90s to create a panel quilt, or a quilt panel that represented the names of the employees who were lost to HIV/AIDS at that time. And this was a time when people were not out at work, say. Even now people aren't all out at work, and there are listings of anonymous, and we did a pop-up exhibit that included this panel, which was really moving and kind of hard to even confront, in terms of like you're being in the room where the people are who put this panel together and then lost their friends and colleagues. But it's really a moving story that is, again, depicted in a lot of these documentaries. The kind of
common threads, I believe, on Canopy.
Let me pull that up. Yeah, great. I haven't watched this one yet, so I'll have to check it out. And actually, John Lewis, the late congressman who passed away recently, was a keynote speaker at the dedication of the AIDS Memorial Quilt papers going to the Library of Congress, I think within a year or two before he passed. And Speaker Pelosi, being from the San Francisco district, as well as other elected officials from California, also have a lot of strong connections to the people who are represented in the quilt, and also have been a big part of the legacy and the safeguarding of this history, which is, for better or for worse, because folks like that represent a position of privilege in mainstream society, so they're not necessarily giving us the comprehensive look. Any other fictional feature films that you'd like to cover, Chris?
There was, I think it was in the last few years, a French movie called BPM that is on Canopy. But again, that was a fictionalization of Act Up Paris. And again, this is unrated movie, but it's very interesting the way it goes into that debate, the activists both bonding and celebrating together, and then they're debating, they're screaming at each other over different tactics because they all want to live. And there's gay men, both white, black. There is a mother and her teenage son, straight son, and the son was infected by a blood transfusion. And it's just an interesting look at the just tumult of emotions that could go through these people that were trying to save each other. It's often kind of said that, like, as you mentioned before, in the early days where maybe queer people left their biological families to live in the new life, and then they made new families within these communities that were just then devastated.
Yeah. Another couple films that I'd love to throw out, one of which I confess I haven't watched it yet, but I did read the book. That first one is And the Band Played On, which is a film version of the Randy Schultz, which was for a while considered the kind of foremost definitive history of the early years of HIV AIDS, which there's a lot of things that have been debunked in it, but it is still reflective of a moment in the history of this. And so there is a feature film of that. The other thing that I'd love to mention is The Normal Heart, which is both a play and a film. The play was written by Larry Kramer, and it follows a few guys, the period of the 80s and early 90s, more so in the 80s, of being exposed to HIV AIDS and getting sick in the early phases. And one of the things that's important to kind of pick up on in all of these depictions, especially the ones that deal with the kind of the early years of things, is that HIV and AIDS were not a known thing from the get-go. For many years, there were other names that were used because folks didn't know what was being dealt with. And there were times when it was called pneumonia. There were times where it was called, I'm blanking on the exact name right now, but there was one where it was very specifically labeled as a gay men's.
They called it gay-related immune deficiency syndrome.
Yeah. And that was even one of the later names. Yeah. And one of the things that I believe is one of the issues with the Schultz book is there was this notion of patient zero, who was the first documented person to be infected and then passing it around. And I believe that for a long time, the person who was thought of as patient zero, it was determined were not actually that patient zero. So The Normal Heart is really important as both a play and then as a film portrayal. And it also, to me, shifts the conversation a bit into the stage, which is a really important place for depictions of HIV and AIDS. We think about Angels in America, of course, as being a canonical American text and play, won the Pulitzer. Very connected to our life now with the role of Roy Cohn, who was this very problematic character who was one of the 45th president's mentors, and who eventually contracted AIDS and was played by Nathan Lade in The Revival, which we got to see. There's also a film version of Angels in America. It exists as a script. You can borrow it from the library to read. Seminal text. There's some fantastical elements in that play, so it might not necessarily be relatable of a depiction for everyone, but super important. And it's one of the great books that you kind of have to know, even though it is originally a play. Another one that I am fond of mentioning is The Inheritance, which was a play that was on Broadway just before the pandemic shut the world down. And it originally ran in London and then came to Broadway. It's another two-part play, just like Angels in America. But it's very much a younger generation's take on HIV AIDS and the whole world that surrounded that, and going back a bit further. And it's too long and too complex to give you a very brief synopsis of, but suffice to say, and it has been nominated for a bunch of Tonys and other awards and stuff. It's really, really excellent play. It really brings you into both the intergenerational issues with HIV/AIDS in that moment, which is a bit different from these other depictions that we talked about. But also it really covers the divisions in terms of there's two of the main characters who are in a relationship, and one of them decides to go to their country house and take care of these men who have been abandoned by their loved ones. And it causes a big rift in their relationship that then has decades of ripple effect. So that's another really special piece of theater and depiction of HIV/AIDS history that I believe is going to be available in some kind of streaming capacity for viewing at some point soon, even if it's just an archival video of the production. But it is like the way that Angels in America was the great work for certain. The Inheritance to me is very that one for our generation, I think. Do you have others?
I've heard of that one.
Any other films or TV shows or documentaries that you'd like to cover?
Another one that is on Canopy. Again, it's covering the earlier years we were here, but it is interesting. It's very stark. It focuses on 5 people, 4 gay men, and a woman nurse, but it tells about the AIDS crisis in San Francisco, but it talks about their lives before the epidemic and just the freedom and liberation that they all found in kind of the hippie neighborhoods of San Francisco. And then it goes into the epidemic itself. But while there's tragedy and sadness and trauma, there's also just these people coming together and saving each other's lives and bringing their own biological family members in as caretakers. And then it ends with them reflecting. There's a flower seller who apparently, from what I know, at least as of last year, still sells flowers there. He tells a story about how people would come in with a single vase and ask them, they didn't have any money, but could he just put some flowers in because they want to help their loved ones to the other side with grace and compassion. And then he remembers this guy who was on the verge of death. He starts coming back to the flower shop, first with a cane, then on his bike again. And there's a sense that there's a real intergenerational sense where some of the men who have survived this plague are talking about to their younger lovers, and it's like they don't have quite the. Again, they say it was like living in a war zone, and they don't want others to have to repeat that.
Yeah, and there's you've set up a perfect segue to relating this discussion of HIV/AIDS to the moment we're living in now with COVID. And you know, when we're further removed from this period, I think there's going to be a lot of work done both on the film side and theater and books around depicting this period, but then also contemplating why the response has been different to COVID than it was to HIV/AIDS in the early years. And of course, you know, one of the primary means of HIV/AIDS being transmitted, and specific in large part to like blood transfusions and sex work and men having intimate relationships, differentiates it a bit but those transmission methods are in many ways the same for COVID. You know, COVID can be transmitted through intimate contact, and COVID has impacted many more people in many different communities on a different scale altogether than HIV. But you know, I think there will be a lot of work done to question why the responses differed from governments then now. Even just thinking about Dr. Fauci, who you mentioned earlier, Dr. Fauci had the same job at the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and in a lot of these films, you see him as the villain because he had to be the spokesperson for a government that was refusing to take significant action fast enough to save lives. And lest anyone forget that the president of the United States in the 1980s went years without even acknowledging publicly that AIDS was a thing. And one of the big tipping points in terms of just the very cursory historical perspective on this that is always referenced is Rock Hudson having come out as HIV/AIDS positive or HIV positive and then dying of AIDS, was because that really affected Nancy Reagan. You know, I think this period with COVID has, for me personally, reminded me, and I think some others at least, of how recent the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic was. Like, we're not very far removed from it. But I think especially for the younger generations who didn't live through it at that moment where everyone was dying, we just don't have that same connection to it as some of our elders. And it'll be really interesting to see how this all plays out with COVID, and then how the depictions happening. Because, you have people now who have been survivors of HIV/AIDS long-term who are dying of COVID. And, what does this mean? What does it mean for Holocaust survivors to be suddenly dying of COVID because of government negligence, basically? And, it's really interesting to see the transformation of the HIV/AIDS activist community with Dr. Fauci. And one of the folks who's depicted in one of these documentaries, Peter Staley, who was a big leader in the ACT UP movement, was someone who was literally on the roofs at buildings at AH screaming at Dr. Fauci. And another one of these characters who was just like Dr. Fauci was the devil back then, because he was the face of this government response, even if he didn't necessarily buy into it, because he was just kind of put out as the fall guy. But to now both those and Dr. Fauci reconciled their differences. And they've been able to look back on that period and kind of understand where each other had been coming from. And I think it's also a great testament to his character, Dr. Fauci, of having the humility to kind of move past those moments, because there were rightfully so some very vicious verbally against him and NIH and the federal government at that time. I know we've gone a little over. Do you have any closing that you'd like to throw out?
Just to add a bit to what you were just saying, it's been very interesting. So I've seen some queer elders and mentor writers that I follow who have reflected on these parallels that they're seeing, that they went through with the HIV epidemic, and what they're seeing now with, similar high-level government officials, ignoring or neglecting the response to a disease that's, striking everybody still. And then, as you said, I was reminded too, when Larry Kramer died earlier this year, Anthony Fauci gave a very heartwarming, but acknowledged the kind of prickly friendship that they had.
Yeah, there's a lot of news coverage actually where about Dr. Fauci and his reflections on Larry Kramer's life. And Larry was one of those figures, to me, Larry is a hero. Larry knew he was going to piss everyone off with his stances, but he was militantly vocal on behalf of saving lives and getting people the help that they needed. That he didn't care about the personal cost, and it cost him many things. It cost him his stature. It made him an outcast even within the LGBTQ plus community. And we owe him a lot for both the activism work and then also the work, both fiction and theatrical, in terms of helping the memory alive of this period. One last closing thought that I have, I just want to tie some of what we've talked about together in terms of the popular culture representation. And, we've touched upon some of the big figures who have come out over time as HIV positive or having AIDS, and it very much is a coming out process beyond your sexuality. Someone who I'd like to just shout out quickly is Jonathan Van Ness, who folks might know from Queer Eye. In his memoir, which just came out a year or two ago, he came out as HIV positive, and also in a big New York Times article. And I don't think enough can be said about when people in the public eye come out as HIV positive, having such a tremendous impact on dampening down the stigma about it. Rock Hudson was one very early example. Magic Johnson was a tremendous example, especially in Black and minority communities of I don't want to use the word normalizing because it is the word that's often used in it, but in terms of really putting it in people's faces that everyone is affected by some of these challenges that we face, and that the discrimination is a problem. And I think when people see people that they idolize as going through something, like we saw with COVID with Tom Hanks, I think that might have been one of the moments where the United States woke up to COVID, was seeing Tom Hanks come crazy. And it takes a lot of courage to do what JVN did, and other, whether it's talking about addiction or history of suicide and or having to cope with HIV. These people are helping others behind them kind of get that of being able to live their full selves, which is really admirable. And I think we have a long way to go with more people needing to kind of do that, but he's a great example of a strong, certainly in a younger generation. So before we wrap, I know we've gone over. This has been a delightful chat. Thank you, Chris, for being willing to do this, and thanks for letting me join you.
Thank you, everyone, for watching in.
Yeah, just a couple things housekeeping wise to throw out. If you would like to check out the films that we have been chatting about, most of them are available in Canopy, which is one of our 2 streaming movie and documentary platforms. You just need a PGCMLS library card to access that. Go to our website, pgcmls.info, and you can go to the online resources tab in the menu, or go to the support suite section and go to the digital suite, and you'll find the link to Canopy. It's very simple. If you have a smart TV, there's actually a Canopy app that you can install on your smart TV, or Amazon Fire Stick or Apple TV, where you can watch it on the big screen. There are also mobile apps that are really great, and I believe it's 10 credits for films per month.
Yeah, 10 a month.
Of course, if you're clever and you have 2 people in your household with a PGCMLS card, that doubles your number, and you've got 20 credits. So if you're a film junkie, we are here for you. There's some really, really spectacular documentaries that you can discover for absolute free in Canopy. The other thing I'd like to just plug is a very special author event that we have coming up on Monday, December 14th at 7 p.m. It's a talk by Maryland native author Zach Smedley, who's going to discuss his YA novel Deposing Nathan, which was a Lambda Literary Award finalist in the past cycle. And Zach will be in conversation with our colleagues Kelsey Hughes from South Bowie branch and Isaiah West from our Teen Services and Program Services team. So we hope you join us for that at 7 p.m. Monday, December 14th. And we are grateful to all of you for being willing to spend some of your time reflecting on World AIDS Day today. We hope that you spread the word about opportunities for folks to exposure to understanding the history of HIV/AIDS, and if you know of anyone that needs some help with getting connected with resources, please connect them with the library. We don't have all the answers, but we know where to send you for the right help. And whether it's social services or health access or healthcare or safe spaces for support, we know where to direct folks. So please, please, please know that we are always here to serve you and anyone in your community, no matter what the need, and we will do what we can to help everyone out. You can connect with us on social media at PGCMLS on all platforms, or send us an email at askalibrarian@pgcmls.info, or call our Ask a Librarian or Biblioconsulta call centers at 240-455-5451. So without further ado, we're going to call it a night and probably go watch TV and learn some more about World AIDS Day. And grateful to everyone, grateful to you, Chris. And a big shout out to our LGBTQ plus team at the library that's been doing some really amazing work in bringing resources and programs to everyone. Good night, everyone.